Good morning, everyone. My name is Chantal, Director of Membership Services at St. Joseph Media. It's great to have you all here on this beautiful morning. We are hosting actually our third TL.talent workshop of the week. TL.talent offers innovative workshops about entrepreneurship, marketing, business development, and more, led by leading executives and city builders in Toronto. Here are some quick housekeeping rules. Please make sure to keep your mics and video turned off until the end in Q&A session. But we encourage you to ask any questions you may have in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to introduce our guest host, Aurora Stewart de Peña, Strategy Director at Taxi, as she leads today's workshop focusing on strategy, narrative, and telling your brand story through historical significant times. Take it away, Aurora. Thank you for joining.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Thank you, Chantal, for the introduction, and thanks, Toronto Life, for having me. I am going to start sharing my screen. Oh, Chantal, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. Is it possible to make me a host?
Yeah, I'll have Dustin do that right now.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Meanwhile, please enjoy this exciting view of my living room. Amazing. I am now the host. Okay. All right, my friends. So we are going to talk about brand storytelling today, and we're going to talk about how a brand story can help serve as a guide for communications during historically significant times. So first, a little bit about me. I think it's funny that I put this very flattering picture of myself up when you can clearly see that I am wearing jogging pants and sitting on a sofa inside, but my name is Aurora de Peña. I'm a writer and a strategist. I have a twofold career. As a playwright, my plays have been produced in Canada, in the US, and the UK. And in the summer, I finished a residency with the Brooklyn College Theatre Department, which will be, which is the last place I'll go for a long time. And I'm a strategy director at Taxi here in Toronto. I've had essays published in Canadian Art, in Vice, in The Outline, in Real Life magazine, and as a strategist, of course, I'm very proud to be part of one of Canada's most awarded agencies. I believe that good strategy tells a unique and true story. Ad stories or communication stories like the stories in play should be grounded in truth and built collaboratively. Today, we're going to talk about brand stories, what they are, when they're good, what they're made of, and how they can guide us. Brands have huge audiences and they spend a lot of money often to get in front of those audiences. So I think that that means they've got a responsibility to make their communications interesting and worthwhile. I believe in brands that build our culture, and we're going to talk about some of those today. So today we're going to talk about stories, what they are and how they work, brands and stories, what brand stories tell us about the brand, building brand narrative, and then we're going to have a conversation. So, stories. When we read dry factual arguments, we read with our dukes up. We're critical and skeptical. But when we're involved in a story, we drop our intellectual guard. We're moved emotionally, and this seems to leave us defenseless. And this is a quote from Jonathan Gottschall from a really wonderful book called Why Storytelling is the Ultimate Weapon. We have been telling stories since the dawn of humanity. Storytelling is a universal feature of every country and every culture, from cave paintings to the wonderful 1985 film Stand By Me, which is the illustration below. Storytelling is extremely important. It's human instinct to weave events into narratives that create context and meaning in our lives. A story in its simplest form is a connection between cause and effect. So our brains are wired to look for these causes and effects or stories. It's actually how we learn. So for instance, I might tell you, I saw a bear in the woods, and you might picture this guy. Bears are really cute. But enough people over the course of history, of human history, have heard stories about bear attacks, angry mama bears, that now we associate bears not with this little waving guy, but with a dangerous predator. So we associate bears with a different set of stimuli. They're big mammals with sharp teeth. They're predators, and maybe they'll eat you. They're carnivorous. They eat meat. That's us. Stories shape the way we experience life, and experience actually shapes the way we absorb stories. Whenever we hear a story, we relate it to one of our existing experiences. So, for instance, you might be a person that loves dogs. And so if I tell you a story about a dog, you might picture a friendly dog. But if you are a person who has experienced in the past being bitten by a dog, or whose formative experiences were with angry dogs, a dog association, a story about a dog to you might not be a pleasant one. So it's interesting. While stories, certainly our own personal stories affect the way we experience the world can also affect the way we experience stories. So, for instance, if you are a kid who lives in a home full of people who react badly to spiders or other bugs in the house, you might experience spiders as something scary. But if you are a kid who reacts to if you're a kid whose family reacts to having a spider in the house by, calmly pointing it out and taking it outside, then you have a different association with spiders. So this just means that stories, our own stories, are very powerful things, and the stories that people tell us are very powerful things. So the way we experience the world shapes the way we experience stories, and the way we experience stories shape the way that we experience the world. Effective storytelling usually employs a really simple emotional framework, even when dealing with complex subject matter. It uses evocative and specific language, and it employs unique metaphors specific to the context. So in this case, the last panel is the Princess Bride, and if you've seen the movie, the trials and travails that they go through are representative of the trials and travails that people go through in order to find lasting love. The middle panel is from Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee, which has a very specific language and script, really strong evocative language written right for the world of that film, and that's what makes the storytelling so effective. And the recent Batman and many of the Marvel superhero, or sorry, this is DC. Many of the comic book movies that have come out over the past couple of decades deal actually with quite complex topics, but use a simple emotional framework of good and evil, of love and loss, of power struggle to tell those stories and break those concepts down. Stories evoke a response. They actually evoke a really physical and visceral response in us. This is because narrative story increases the flow of oxytocin and cortisol to your brain, which provokes an emotional and visceral response. So often when we are really engaged in a story or wrapped up in a story, our body is responding as though the story is happening to us, which makes it an extraordinary tool. Makes storytelling an extraordinary tool, not just for brands, but to persuade anyone to come around to see your point. As you can see with this image here, the people watching, this is a snapshot of people watching a horror movie, and maybe you've had these reactions as well, but you'll see something on the screen or hear something in the story, and it provokes a physical response, and you react as though it's happening to you, and you cover your eyes and you clench your teeth and you want to look away, but of course you're safe in your theater seat. So when we take in a story, it's interesting, our brains and emotions react as though they're happening to us, and the degree to which they do that depends on the effectiveness of the story being told, the language and the tools being used to tell the story, and the skill of the storyteller as well. So let's talk a little bit about language. Stories are actually only as good as the words, and I should say images, that make them. Overused tropes and well-worn narratives do not evoke a strong emotional response. In fact, they might not evoke any. And you know this if you've sat through, a really boring fourth quarter wrap-up. at your work and someone is telling the story of the fourth quarter of the businesses you work on's financial performance in a dry way using a lot of jargon. Studies show that the more times a story or a metaphor or a simile or an arc or even bits of language have been heard, the less likely the brain's sensory cortexes are to be engaged. So specificity is really key to telling a good story. Small note, this is, I probably have a lot of people who work in marketing or business on the presentation today. Watch out for garbage language. This is, the idea of garbage language is a bit of a new one, but these are overused tropes and phrases that commonly creep into workplace vocabulary. And this is the definition that I like best. And it's a quote from a book by Anna Wiener called Uncanny Valley, story of her working in a Silicon Valley startup. So people used a sort of non-language, which was neither beautiful nor especially efficient, a mashup of business speak with athletic and wartime metaphors, inflated with self-importance, calls to action, front lines and trenches, blitz scaling, companies didn't fail, they died. And anyone who works in a contemporary office is probably familiar with language like this. The illustration on the right, how do we future-proof the initiative? Let's drop a pin on this and take it offline. With these key learnings, we can co-create innovative win-wins. This sort of language becomes repetitive and creeps into the way we tell brand stories and creeps into the way corporations talk about their brand stories and can have the effect of dulling. So repetitive jargon, as we talked about on the previous slide, can have the effect of producing the opposite effect we want a story to tell. So it makes for bad storytelling, essentially. So for more on this, I recommend reading a piece called The Garbage Language by Molly Young, the article from which I pulled this image. And so a story is functional. It helps us learn. It helps us contextualize. A story is a thing that does rather than a thing that is. It's a tool with utility rather than an object for aesthetic admiration. Just because you tell a story doesn't mean people have to listen, as you may have experienced from sitting through a Q4 report. Not that I sat through a particularly bad Q4 report lately. It's just something that's happened in the past. But something to remember is that attention is the reward that listeners bestow on the storyteller, and you gain it by telling a good, evocative, unique, specific story. So, talked a little bit about stories, and now I want to talk about brands and stories. So, what is a brand? Everyone has their own definition. This is mine. Brands are traits attributed to a product, a service, a person, or a group, brought to life through experiences, actions, voice, and visuals associated with a product, service, person, or group, collected under one name. So here, sorry, give me a few seconds. I'm just going to move my chat window out so I can take a look at, sorry. No, I'm not. Here, I've collected a bunch of brands that I think have told their stories really well. So those can be people. In the case of Mr. Rogers, they can be people who have become iconic symbols, probably didn't intend to become brands, like Che Guevara. My mom is from Cuba, so he is a figure that's loomed large in life for us Cubans, but also it's interesting to see him on, every T-shirt on Canadian first-year university students. There is Levi's, an extraordinary heritage brand that has built their brand through storytelling and through associations over the years. Oprah is really fascinating because she is a person who easily transitioned into a series of brands, a brand empire. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into Patagonia. And we'll go a little bit deeper into all of these, but yeah. So the term brand story gets thrown around a lot, and it drives me a little bit crazy. and everyone seems to have a different set of definitions. People use it to mean a lot of different things. Like when they're telling their brand story, they might talk about how their brand started. They might talk about the reason for a brand's existence. There was a really well circulated talk by Simon Sinek 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 100 years ago. I don't know. This month has lasted a century. Anyway, there was a really well circulated talk by Simon Sinek in which he speculated that the reason for a brand's existence, the why, is the primary story you want to tell. People will also say that their brand story is how the brand operates as an entity, i.e. driving values. That's another iteration of why. Why the brand's name and design cues are significant to the brand's perspective. That's at the forefront of Starbucks' story, talking about the mermaid and their sort of literary cues. The individual stories of the people who run the brand, that's at front and center of now sort of struggling brand Tom Shoes, and the dominant experience of the brand's stakeholders and what the brand stakeholders hope the experience people will have with the brand is. So McDonald's is an example of that. So these elements are often bullet points in the back corner of a website, and often they're not told in a story way, as in they're not built to evoke emotion or a sensory reaction, and they don't use specific or particularly unique language. But I think a brand story can and should be all of these elements. You build your brand's larger narratives by deciding which elements to highlight and telling them well and telling them everywhere you can. And there's a dangling and for you. So if a brand story is told effectively over time, the story elements become shorthand for the brand itself. So when we think of Patagonia, a lot of us might think of ethical, sustainable, good quality, progressive. They're a good employer. These other brands, we have Levi's, tough, classic, unpretentious, counterculture. Ferrari, speed, luxury, performance, style. Che Guevara, resistance, revolution, anti-capitalism. Air Jordans, athletic, virtuosic, elite, playful. You could fill out these bubbles for all of these, and I'll bet that we would come up with similar adjectives to describe each brand. And it's because, in large part, the brands have done such good jobs of telling the stories of their products. So in the best case scenario, the brand becomes shorthand for the collection of traits its stories highlight. And if we were discussing, I would ask us to look at the Oprah brand and see what collection of traits that brand embodies, and see if we come up with the same collection of traits. So if you feel up to it, enter a couple in the chat, and let's just see if we all have the same perception of the Oprah Winfrey brand. So building a brand narrative. What is a brand narrative? Well, it's a sequence of events, actions, and reactions taken by your brand and or its associated people. Again, it's not just how or why your brand started. That's part of your narrative, but it's not the whole thing. Your brand narrative is the complete compiled stories about how your brand interacts with the world. So, Patagonia. Let's take a look at Patagonia. Founded by an avid climber, Yvon Chouinard, he noticed the equipment he used damaged the faces of the rocks he climbed. He and his partners Tom Frost and Melinda Chouinard began creating and selling their own uninvasive equipment. Chouinard and his partners branch out, creating proprietary, effective clothing for outdoor sport. The recession in 1991 forced Patagonia to lay off 20% of their workforce. They'd become reliant on a growth they could sustain. So this forced Chouinard to reflect on what kind of business Patagonia should be, and changed his business model. ski and climbing trips, a cafeteria serving free organic food, on-site childcare, and an open office policy made Patagonia famous for its good employment practices. They won a number of awards and were recognized as America's best employer by Forbes just shortly after the recession hit and their layoffs. So they bounced back and told that story very, very well. The organization made a commitment to donating 10% of each year's profits to environmental organizations. They held workshops for grassroots activists, as well as creating and backing one major environmental educational campaign a year. I believe this started when they began attending town hall meetings for the region that their head office was located in, and were inspired by an activist who was working to make a difference in a local river, halting development on a local river. They gave him office space, and that fit with their ideology, with their mission to create products for outside that didn't harm the outside, and so became an organization of activists, of environmental activists. And as people today are looking for brands that represent their values in a society that increasingly wants to buy from brands that do good according to them, and with climate change top of mind and being good to the earth top of mind, the brand's profile continues to grow. And it has enjoyed particular resurgence over the past couple of years as that's top of mind. So it's interesting. So how your brand moves in the world determines your narrative. And you can build the elements of your brand's story, your brand's narrative, by taking action, reacting, and choosing how to talk about those actions and reactions and telling those stories really well. So for instance, Patagonia reacted to the damage of rock climbing, reacted to the damage rock climbing equipment had on rock faces by creating rock-friendly equipment. Reacted to the session by reimagining the way their company worked, acted by contributing a portion of profits to environmental organizations, and chose those stories to tell as part of their larger brand narrative. A lot of other things probably happened at Patagonia over the 60 some odd years, began in the mid 50s. Yeah, 60 some odd years that Patagonia has existed. You know, who knows, maybe they got an exciting new vending machine in their organic cafeteria, or, you know, maybe they tried some things and those things didn't work out. But the choice to highlight what they reacted and acted to form their larger brand narrative. And the way that they're told, with emphasis on the values that drive, the emotional frameworks that drive them, have all contributed to make Patagonia a brand with a really strong brand narrative. Which means that already established brand narrative can serve as a guide during crisis. So when COVID-19 hit, Patagonia's move was inspiring, but it wasn't necessarily, I think, surprising to people who follow the brand. Comparable to when you compare it to brands like Amazon, who have coughed and sputtered and, you know, despite making trillions of dollars, but one might argue their brand reputation is suffering. It is interesting to look at Patagonia immediately making the move to halt operations, but continue to pay their employees, because it is par for the course for Patagonia and what I think people have come to expect from that brand, knowing that it's owned and operated by someone who can certainly afford the cost. So understanding that they are a good employer and that that's critical to the brand, and that's a story they've told, and a story they've told over and over again and kind of everywhere. This is a guide that helps them understand what to do when coronavirus hit. Now, the brand has resumed operations, but the time that they took away from from operating allowed them to put heat sensors in place that that help detect whether or not people are sick, and so they have sort of come back to work on their online operations with a stronger set of criteria to help people stay safe during COVID-19 than some of their competitors who kept going. So I want to have a bit of a discussion, talk about what choosing the elements of your brand narrative might be. So here is a quote by Jeff Bezos: "Your brand is what people say about you when you are not in the room." This, I think, is a good thing to remember, but right now people are saying a lot of negative things about Jeff Bezos and Amazon, because he has forgotten that he is also part of his brand story. So I think something that we maybe didn't touch on is that you can choose what to say about your brand, but you also are constantly telling your brand story through your actions and through your reactions. So, you know, an unsafe environment for workers, bad pay, all of these things are going to contribute to your brand story. And there's sort of the way you tell isn't just limited to the public communications that you put out into the world, but also in the way you act. Your brand's narrative is the sum total of what people know about you and your brand. Everything from how your organization started to the way you treat your employees. So you want to put your stories to work for you in a way that's positive. So brand narrative thought starters. What are the stories that define your brand? Not a history or how you got to where you are, but what shaped your values? What made you realize what kind of an organization you wanted to be? Are these stories unique to you? Can they get personal? Can they be told in a way that belongs only to you? What do these stories tell other people about your brand and the way it moves in the world? How can you tell your brand story? Like in the case of Amazon, it's not just your public-facing communications, but how do you act in the world? What will PR pick up about you? And finally, as a collection, how could these stories help guide you towards the actions you want to take in the future? And I have a couple of other thoughts that we could get to, but I wanted to stop here because I've been talking at you for 33 minutes now, and I'd love to hear from you.
So we have a couple questions here already. Thank you for this. This is super, super great. And I think that just now more than ever, it's really interesting to see how brands are pivoting and going in either the right direction, or as you mentioned with Amazon, really have to be careful with the way they're putting themselves out there. So here's the first question. I have here. Oh, so do you have any insight on a brand that's actually been doing a very good job on their campaigns? As we've seen in the last couple of months, we noticed that a lot of brands are actually doing very similar, like throwing very similar campaigns out there with like the same, you know, low tone and slow music at the beginning of their commercials. Is there a brand that has actually stand out, you know, in your eyes, that you think that they've been like really unique with the way they've been approaching their brand during these crazy times?
So I have a couple thoughts about that. When you see those compilations of like 50 brands essentially making the same spot or putting the same communications out into the world, honestly, and using the same language even, honestly, I think of it this way. We received, all of us as marketers, a really clear brief from the World Health Organization. And that brief was to stay inside and do what you can to help. So that everybody that everybody had the impetus to communicate in exactly the same way, to me demonstrates how clear the instructions were from the bodies that govern us about what to do. So every brand came out with a stay inside ad. Every brand came out with some version of we're here to help. And now every brand there's like another wash of tropes that is beginning to emerge, that is sort of like a yoga studio optimism and some like keep calm and carry on grit. And, so I think for the first couple of months, the fact that all major brands said basically the same thing, it's for sure hilarious to watch those compilations, but like we need to go a little bit easy on ourselves. We all just made it through the first 2 months of a pandemic, and marketers are just people. So the sea of same, it's not ideal. It would have been great if this had been a time of like bustling and bubbling creativity, but honestly, I think most people just had a hard time doing their laundry. So that the first couple of months of the pandemic communications are the same. I will look back on that and laugh, and have already begun to look back on it and laugh. But I do think that now is the time to begin distinguishing yourself. And this is where you can lean into specific things like story and tone and what your brand has stood for in the past. There was a really great spot by Burger King in the US. And it had sort of like an Uncle Sam wants you voiceover, and that was about like, now we are being called upon to sit inside and stay on our couches. And it was an advertisement for Burger King's delivery. And I thought that was clever. And my gosh, if you can make someone laugh in these moments and do it in a way that's specific to your brand and your brand voice and in keeping with your stories, then go for it. So don't feel too bad about being part of the sea of same if you were. I know that the brand that I worked on, we did our darndest. I don't think I've ever used the expression did our darndest before. All kinds of new experiences in quarantine. But everyone essentially has to communicate the same things in those months. We're keeping people safe. We're keeping people healthy. We're looking after employees. We're looking after our customers. That's okay. Everyone needs that information. Now that we've got that under our belt, it's time to move away from that a bit. So the Burger King example is the best I've seen. I'm looking forward to seeing more. I'm looking forward to doing more. We've got some exciting things under our belt at Taxi. I can't say what they are, but I think they'll be clever. If I can think of anything else, I mean, right now I'm seeing all the same spots as everyone, but the Burger King one stands out.
Okay, that's amazing. There was a comment from Trisha too. She said that I thought Dove was very clever. They came out with really early, but showed frontline workers with impact of wearing masks. It was very emotional, but on strategy for their brand. So I think a lot of brands have done that as well. It was like really impactful the way that they projected it, even if it was very similar to other brands.
Yeah, that was a good one. And thanks, Trisha. I think that's a wonderful example of leaning into your stories and using them as a guide, because Dove knows that they talk about beauty in the skin that we live in as being more than the pursuit of aesthetic perfection. So that's a wonderful example if anyone has seen that spot. But they leaned into the idea that our skin is more than just about showing skin that isn't a sort of like airbrushed ideal. And they use their sort of previous storytelling as a guide to get them there. And I think that was a really beautiful example.
It is, I agree. Here's another question. So what are some tactics that can help change how people feel about my brand? Is it even possible to change their minds if they dislike me?
Um,
Jason, was that you, Jason? I think it was.
yeah, Jason, keep posting the workout selfies. I think they're really, I think they're really changing people's perception. The food stuff is good too. Um, yeah, I think I'd love some more context if the person is willing to give it. Every situation is different. Um, but yeah, of course, you can change people's perception of you. It takes longer to rebuild trust than it does to just have it and maintain it. So if something has occurred in which your brand has broken trust, certainly worked for enough brands that have done that. The answer is demonstrating honesty and action and telling the story of that action as authentically and transparently as possible. Um, that is the way forward if you've breached trust. Um, yeah, I hope that answers the question, but if not, I invite the asker to get more specific and maybe I can too.
He says yes, but he also mentioned he's always on brand. So we'll just leave
Oh,
it
this
at that,
totally Jason.
Jason.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. What are the best channels to tell a brand story? Is social media still king, or are there better, more intimate platforms that we can?
My gosh, there's a million. Social media is I think, one that comes to mind for a lot of people. It's the most accessible if you run a small brand. Um, However, I think there are lots of ways. Being active in the community and working to generate earned media is, I think, the best way to tell your brand story, because then sneakily other people are telling it for you. Like, I can get on Instagram and post a selfie and tell everyone how beautiful I look, or someone else can say it and then it's suddenly more believable. Um, we're going to try that out later. JK. But I think social media works, earned works, but quite honestly, right now during COVID-19, our media agencies have shown us that a lot more people are watching TV. So TV still works, and we're all gathered around the same media right now. But point is, there are many. I think social media is great though. And depending on your brand, the platform might vary. Like if you're a brand that's working to develop thought leadership, Twitter might be better for you. If you are a lifestyle brand, Instagram, lots of different ways to tell.
I agree. I think that especially like now more than ever, we notice that Instagram, it could be a positive place to communicate with friends and family during these times. It was mostly seen as something negative, but I feel like it kind of flipped a little bit in the last couple months, where we realized that we can really connect with a lot more people through these platforms versus looking at it on like a negative lens.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I mean, if I think, what did I read a stat, like Instagram usage went up something like 250% in the month of March. It was a stat. Where did I pull that? I think came from Sprout Social. Um, but and so we're on all the time and learning and trying to distract ourselves, so it's a good time to begin telling your story, or to continue telling your story, or to tell your story to a new, engaged, and unfortunately very captive audience.
For sure. We have a question from Nat here. What do you recommend when the story is complex, maybe even challenging, and there's concern about making the story accessible to the audience?
I want to know more.
Maybe Nat, if you want to elaborate here, I'll ask another question. I'll give you just a couple seconds. I'll ask another question in the meantime. So how do you measure how people feel about a brand separate of sales? What are some performance indicators of brand success?
I think conversation about you. Social listening is a great tool to you know there are lots of tools that make social listening easier, but honestly, just like getting on a social media platform and finding out what people are saying about your brand, looking at your mentions. Share a voice, looking at how much space your brand takes up, looking at what people are saying, how they're saying it, their positive associations. Sales are a good indicator. Sometimes sales mean that someone needs something, or sometimes sales mean that you are the only contender within your very specific category. But I think brand love can also be measured by listening to what people say about you, how they say it, how frequently they say it, whether or not detractors to your brand, and there will always be detractors if you have a public presence at all, whether or not your fans stand up for you is a great way to measure brand love. Independent mentions.
Okay. Nat, do you want to turn your mic on and maybe elaborate on your question? Let's see if Nat's still there. Or I'll go to the next question. We'll give some time.
Sure.
Okay, so what is the most exciting project you worked on that you're super proud of? Is there one that really stands out where you're like, this is one that I'm so proud of, that with a client or with anyone that you can share with us?
Well, oh man, there's one that's coming up that I'm so excited about that I can't talk about at Taxi. Something that we're doing, we're doing in partnership with an LGBTQ organization. That doesn't tell you anything, but it will be cool when it comes. I was really excited and honored to work on Casey House. Casey House is an HIV hospital in Toronto. It is one of the first in the world standalone HIV hospitals. And we got to tell that brand's story in a way that was really, I think, impactful. The shorthand is that the people who should have been donating weren't donating to Casey House. They felt a disconnect with the organization. They felt that HIV was a problem that had been solved in the 1980s, and that had been solved, in the 1990s, and that people with HIV didn't need much concerted attention and service in the way that they used to. And so we developed a project to connect HIV positive people today who need support with the public who can help them. And we did that by staffing a restaurant with HIV positive chefs and getting people to come into that restaurant. And it was wonderful because people all over the world picked up the story. The restaurant was packed every night, and we achieved our goal of not just telling the larger story of Casey House, the organization, but helping individual people connect their stories with each other. So hearing the stories of the individual clients at Casey House, and I was so proud to be part of that. And there's, of course, lots to look forward to on the horizon with Taxi too, but it's proprietary.
Oh, that's completely understandable, but that's amazing about Casey House. Nat just came in and said that mic wasn't working, so feel free to turn your mic on now and you can ask your question.
Okay, is it working now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so this is all so interesting and helpful. And my question, I think often, like, seeing Patagonia's brand story laid out, it's like so clearly picked up on really key moments. But as you mentioned, there's so much that goes on within an organization, and really identifying those things can be challenging when you're in it. And so I specifically work for a coffee company. I work for Pilot Coffee, and our brand is really about connecting great coffee and people and making great coffee really accessible. But there's so much in the supply chain and in the business of coffee that's really challenging, and the industry as a whole maybe hasn't found a really concise way to speak to, from, price crisis, producers, the struggles at origin where coffee is produced, and how to like build value around the point of difference of specialty coffee. So I was interested, I think the hesitancy trying to really challenge consumers, or, seem to make things more difficult or tell that more challenging storyline as a part of the larger brand story. I was interested to hear your insight on approaches to breaking that down, or how to know where that access point might be.
That is a super cool question, and thank you for asking. I'm glad you got specific. First of all, live just across the street from Pilot Coffee, or like across the block from Pilot Coffee at Queen and Ossington. Come find me, everybody. But I think that the complexity of that story is a huge opportunity, and too often the coffee industry glosses over it. So what you see are pictures of smiling farmers with baskets, and that kind of a singular story probably isn't useful to the industry. And from what I understand about your brand, correct me if I'm wrong, but you do a lot of work with like fair trade and ethical trade, and differentiating beans and blends. And I think what you have is the opportunity to tell a lot of stories and to make an education play and to own that, because there's some white space there as people try to simplify it. And honestly, I think now is the time to do that as people become more aware of the complexities in supply chains. So I that's a huge challenge, and now I wish I was working on that brand. But I would find ways to tell those complex stories and figure out what larger umbrella they sit under, which is probably something like it's not as easy as I don't know. Anyway, I think you have a lot of rich, complex stories that you could tell, and I think that the people who love coffee would be interested in hearing them. You see a bit of that with wine, actually. There's like I think the wine selling, the LCBO has, follow me down this rabbit hole, a kind of similar challenge, because grape growers and climates and individual sort of practices of winemaking are what make wines interesting, as well as the fact that they feel nice to drink. But the LCBO has done an interesting job of telling sort of a top line insight that they are telling a series of global stories. And I think Pilot has that opportunity too.
Cool. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Reach out to me anytime. That's a whole problem to work through.
Awesome. And Ossington just opened yesterday for limited like offering and distanced offering. So hopefully see you there.
I love drinking coffee at a distance from people.
Nat, how do you feel about that reopening yesterday? How's that going?
I haven't gone yet because I'm trying to kind of give them time and not overwhelm, but I think it was really positive, and just going to continue to learn and adjust. Obviously, we want to do it really safely. But yeah, I'm really excited. It feels like a step in the right direction, and I know the 10 retail staff that were able to come back to work are really happy about it too.
That's great to hear. I live down the street from it as well, so I can't wait to go back in. I think that's all for questions here. If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to type them in right now. And or I know we have about 5 minutes left. So was there more that you wanted to present, or is there anything else that you want to close off with?
No, I feel good about where we've landed. I want to just thank everyone for joining, and keep me apprised of your brand stories.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. This was so educational. I think a lot of people have connections with different brands, and this is a great presentation. So thank you again for your time today. And thank you everyone for joining us.